Tatyana, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and how you help people.
Gosh, that's a big question all in one. Well,
Let's start with who you are.
sure. So my name is Tatyana Kholodkov. I'm a licensed psychologist in Durham, North Carolina, although I practice virtually also in 40 states. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a first generation immigrant. And professionally, what I love to do is to help people reduce suffering and enhance their quality of life. And I do that through a couple of different ways in my group practice, in therapy, integrative health coaching, and sometimes also using non traditional therapeutic approaches, including psychedelic therapy.
Okay. Wow. So that's going to be a big topic of our discussion today. But tell me a bit about what was your journey? How did you come to be Tatyana as you are right now? Tell us your story.
Well, me as a human, I've always just been really curious and interested in sort of engrossing myself in whatever is in front of me. Have always been kind of seeking a flow state since I was a really young child, which lent itself well to different practices. Like I studied martial arts for a really long time when I was younger. And even through that, sort of discovered that there's like more capacities we have than what we might assume about ourselves. And that there's ways we can grow or challenge ourselves or overcome fear because the mind is really powerful and we can train it to take us different places. But otherwise, I had a relatively traditional upbringing as an immigrant, acclimating to America and diving straight into mainstream school. After I graduated high school, I went on straight to college thinking I was going to go into medicine and then made a pivot towards psychology, which was really, really compelling for me. Took a little bit of time off to do full time work, clinical work, before venturing to my master's in Virginia and then my PhD in Wyoming, where I did a lot of research as well as clinical work, including working a lot with veteran populations in the summertime. And did my internship at the VA and a postdoc at Duke Integrative Medicine. So I've always been interested in how can we use interdisciplinary approaches, different perspectives, to support our own self-awareness and also in terms of tools for healing for other people. In my free time, I practice yoga and go outside and spend time in my community doing all kinds of different things.
Where in Virginia did you study? Because I grew up near DC in Virginia.
South of DC, I did my master's at Old Dominion University in Virginia. It was a very research focused master's program that I started from before launching into my PhD after that.
Wow. Very cool. And where did your family immigrate from?
So my family immigrated from Moscow. I am Russian, Jewish, and Ukrainian in my heritage.
Well, that okay, I'm not much for politics, but it sounds like you have lots of strings being pulled with current events, I'm sure.
No kidding. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. My parents are both Ukrainian in a lot of their upbringing, and that's where they grew up. So unfortunately, much of my family has seen the relics of their childhood destroyed. It's certainly a challenging state of the world right now.
My goodness. And tell me more about what drew you to psychology as opposed to other fields of study.
Well, originally, it actually started in high school. I read a book called She's Come Undone by Wally Lamb, which was the story of a young woman. Her life falls apart, and then she sort of starts putting it back together through the help of a therapist. And so that was really intriguing to me and pretty impactful because I had always considered really medicine as the only way to think of like healing and helping. And then when I was working in my undergraduate degree, I just found that there's so much that's interesting about consciousness. And it was also kind of supplemented by my other interests of thinking about like what is existence and who are we and what is the mind. So all of that kind of continued to layer upon itself, and why I kept going with it.
I you're you're speaking to me because those are so many of the reasons why I chose to study psychology as well. I'll say the fact that so much of your interest you're pinpointing to a a story, at least a moment of crisis, of transformation, I think to me is really impactful because, in fact, let me share right now. One of the few books that goes deep and I've read is something called The Archetype of Initiation.
Mm,
And I love going into these existential things about what does it mean when your life falls apart and how do you
mhm.
put yourself back together? Can you actually put yourself back together? What help do you need too? And
Yes.
so let me ask you, so I'm operating as an executive coach, and I've spent a good amount of time educating the listeners on what a coach is and what a coach isn't. So maybe you can talk about what a therapist is and what they aren't.
Mm. Sure. Well, one thing I'll say is a therapist is just another human, although they may have a lot of
Hmm.
experience and might have, talents that lend themselves to do this work. They're also at the core just another human being who has their own heart and their own health and their own longings. And so I really want to humanize the profession because I think sometimes people think about a therapist as like someone who somehow knows it all and has all their shit together, and that is just how it creates actually almost a disconnect between a person who might be seeking support from
Hmm.
a therapist and the therapist themselves. But I would also say that a therapist is not a person who's an expert in your life. It's a person who might have a lot of tools and the ability to help guide someone on their path, but they are not there to tell you how you should be or what values you should be living your life according to. And their role is even not necessarily to give you advice. They're there to support you in whether that is healing or clarity or growth, but to also not impose themselves or get in the way.
Hmm. There are quite a few instances that perpetuate these stereotypes about what a relationship with a therapist looks like, and a lot of what you're saying we're not trying to be anymore, you're not trying to be, many therapists are moving away from, is this idea of being the authority of someone else's life, because there does seem to be a tension between I am qualified, I am capable, but I'm not going to be just the person that tells you what to do either.
That's right. And I do think we have such a power dynamic that's just in general in our Western American medical system, and therapy falls commonly under the medical system. So then it gets even more complicated where people are thinking, like, I'm coming to you, and, a therapist may have a role in helping assess, perhaps assign a diagnosis if that is even useful to what you're working with. And all of that can be helpful. And they might even give suggestions on what approaches might be useful or help you sort through your goals and decide where should together decide, what's a good starting place. But I do think that there's also a lot of ways in which a client really owns the therapy process and may even get as much out of it as they end up putting into it too.
Well, yeah, I hope so. I'll relate all this to my experience in being involved with social work as well as a student and student researcher, back in those days, where learning about one course I took was called abnormal psychology. We're talking about clinical levels of things that can go wrong in someone's mind and someone's psyche. And in social work, we see a lot of instances where that is someone's actual life. Things are not healthy in a lot of ways. And
Yes.
one way that I delineate uh, coaching from therapy is that therapy, you have the tools and the training to go into those depths. Whereas a coach, not that they can't, but they are going to be focused much more on taking the present and making an ideal future out of that rather than dealing with all the past and sorting that out. So maybe expand on what your experience has been as a therapist in that way.
Well, to me, I think it really varies what a person comes for. I think it's not uncommon that a person is
Mm,
experiencing some kind of discomfort, and that is what's prompting them to go to therapy. Um, sometimes people are generally, doing well and still come to therapy, whether that's to explore some aspect of their identity or to make sure they're not repeating, let's say, certain generational patterns, or even for things like relationship enhancement as a couple or maybe even as part of like premarital counseling. But oftentimes people might come when there is
mm,
some sort of acute distress, and that might be the reason they're reaching out specifically to a therapist as they're looking for help and maybe they're looking for symptom relief. But generally, when I work with clients, that's sort of like phase one of what the work that we do. And subsequently,
mm,
our work ends up turning into, perhaps once the more immediate acute distress is lessened, then what? What else is your life about? Where else might you need support, or where do you want more growth and strength? And so it's almost like moving out of focus as much on just symptoms to expanding that lens to what's meaningful and how do we enhance your quality of life, help you be more present.
mm. I greatly appreciate that because we can get uh, too focused on a binary idea of what a certain profession is, what a certain practice is, and what it isn't. But like you're saying, there's an evolution in every therapy or coaching relationship where typically, yeah, someone starts out having such enough discomfort that they're going to seek out help. Before
Mhm.
then, they're more or less satisfied just living with it, but it'll come to a point where they need help. They seek it out. The healing practitioner will assist them and guide them through that healing. But then after that, tell me more about that more as opposed to the clinical side, the more positive psychology side of making good things better. And what does that look like in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think of it as it all comes together, right? Like sometimes the reason why we are experiencing, let's say, depression is because there is a gap between who we'd like to be and who we are, or there's important domains in our life that we're not tapping into. And so it's really impossible to just somehow treat the depression without necessarily thinking about also enhancing someone's life. And similarly with, other things that maybe perhaps once, let's say, symptoms of PTSD are more reduced, then a person can think about like, okay, so in what way can that open up my world? Do I now want to connect more with other people? Am I now feeling less afraid to take on opportunities that in the past I would give up or pass on because they didn't feel possible for me? So really, no matter where I might start with a client, I do try to keep this broader view for them in mind of themselves, that they are also more than their suffering, and they are more than what they have kind of biographically lived through. And so, how do we connect with that and remember that that's already there inside of them?
Hmm. What kind of outcomes have you seen from your clients?
Well, it really varies. Of course, including what we're working
Sure,
on.
sure.
I
Big question.
the primary areas I work on is I help with folks with the spectrum of anxiety, including kind of more global anxiety, but also panic disorder and OCD. I often work with folks that have overlapping trauma and OCD, and a lot of individuals with depression, many of whom also have, just across clients in general, have co-occurring health concerns, because this is all one mechanism. So what's happening in our emotional and mental, spiritual state, our body is not immune to. So people often will have symptoms of like inflammation and chronic health concerns that are going on at the same time. So generally what I find is that clients get skills that help them maybe change their relationship with their mind or their emotions. They're able to heal some of their trauma and maybe move on from aspects of the past that are not so helpful to keep going over in their mind, to feel like they can be their more authentic self, to rediscover pleasure and joy, and even just a little bit more ease and peace in their body, all the way up to helping people meet kind of the end of their life and the life of people that they might care about, and how do you go through that gracefully.
Hmm. What have you learned about yourself as you've practiced?
Oh, I learn something all the time. I often find myself reflecting, not in a way where like I'm taking on a client's issues, but I do find myself sort of asking myself, how do I relate to some of these things? Or if there are maybe some pieces of a person's experience that's either similar or very different than what I've lived through, I just sort of reflect upon it. It's made me be profoundly more aware of my privilege, both as a, cis het white lady, but even my immigrant story is very different than what other individuals have lived through. Um, I find that I can access greater empathy for clients too, because I think about my own ways I've dealt with suffering or tremendous life difficulties. Um, but I also learned that, yeah, I have a pretty big heart, and this is one of the ways I really like loving people, is to help them see that they're not broken. That's something that often happens, is people will hit some kind of difficulty in their
Mm.
life, or maybe even get some kind of diagnosis, and now their image of themselves is just has fallen. And I want to help them remember, like, no, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you, and we all need a little help sometimes.
Wow.
Not sure if that answers your question.
My
Tell me what you're
experience
thinking.
as no, we're definitely gonna dive deeper on that. I relate to it in the sense that as I've been in helping professions and am working as a coach, so often I feel, I would say, not humiliated, but just made more aware of where conversations tend to go with the person I'm in conversation with, the thing that they realize, the thing that they need to hear and then act on is usually something that I'm not being the best at myself. And so there's a certain irony and responsibility in being in that role where it requires a lot more awareness and integrity to do it well, because often you need to be taking your own medicine on some things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious on
Yeah.
what your experience has been.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly agree with that. And I validate the heck out of how sometimes one small change can be just a tremendous amount of effort. I mean, I feel that in my own experience too. Or, when a person is starting a new habit, I will remind them how normal it is to need to do it repeatedly and keep adjusting, and that it's just as hard for me as it is for them. Because for each of us, I think the kind of projects we have might be different, but we all have our stuff, every one of us. What might be easy for
Mm.
me might be really challenging for someone else, but then in another domain, those roles will be reversed. But I do have to take good care of myself. I can't be at like 11 p.m. scrolling on my phone, because I have to be in bed so that I'm an alert, compassionate therapist at 7 in the morning. Think even little things like that. You're really right to point to. We have to take our own medicine. And I also think of the idea of the wounded healer. It's really important for us to do our own work, especially as it relates to psychedelic work. Not only so we can better understand the terrain that our clients might find ourselves in, but also so that we can be more grounded and centered for them, and that they can be in whatever space they need to be in.
Hmm. It's not often I get to have this kind of conversation. I'm excited to ask you this because you let me know what you've seen, because in my experience I've both seen myself and have heard others criticize the healing professions, as the people who go into it are typically the ones that are just trying to figure themselves out and then have to make a living somehow on the end of it. And so I I'm curious what your experience has been, because you mentioned the idea of the wounded healer, this archetype of the one who's been through the pain and done the work can be the one that also brings others through that. How do we acknowledge that sometimes people go into this stuff trying to figure themselves out and then move into this ability, this capability to help others do the same?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great point you're making. I think that comes back to the notion that I don't think any human is inherently broken. And so it creates just a little bit of separation between the professional and not. I do think that therapists might be more interested in looking at themselves, but so are people who are various forms of spiritual seekers and philosophers and poets. And there's many different ways that looks. So there might be more of a self inquiry, but I do want to challenge the notion that just because that is something that someone is doing, that they're not capable of helping somebody else. And in fact, I do think that the more that we can at times be able to own our own stuff and be willing to look at ourselves, then perhaps it is easier to support others while also still being humble that you're guiding them. You can't necessarily totally take somebody off of their path. Our role isn't to completely rescue people out of their circumstances either. We each have our own kind of walk to do. So I don't know if that captures what you're asking or not, but if not, ask me more.
No, of course. I appreciate that, because there are uh, critical voices to a lot of things. People who don't have the best experience, they go in to therapeutic relationships or coaching relationships with the wrong idea of what it's supposed to be, wrong expectations, and being able to say, yeah, it might seem like the people who are most interested in doing this are the ones who themselves have the most amount of work to do, but like you're saying, there's power in being able to acknowledge your interest, feed it, do the work, and then turn around and help others along their way who may not look. Not everyone's as interested as you or I in the psyche and helping people in these specific ways. So it's good for us to have that space to to help others in the way that we do.
Yeah. That does, of course, need to come with boundaries, right? If I need
Right.
to be assessing myself, and if someone is walking in with some kind of concern that for some reason is way too fresh for me, or is just touches nerves that I think would start to distract me in the context of our work, I really need to do the right ethical thing and refer them to somebody else. But at the same time, sometimes shared experience can also be useful. So I see a lot of people for grief, some of whom I might tell them that, I lost my father in 2015. But before I share anything, I really first check in with my impulse of why am I sharing this? And two is I will, before sharing anything, say
Mm.
to a client, I'm not going to pretend that anything about my experience is at all the same as yours, but I want to offer you this in case there's anything about that that's useful or helpful. And so, in that way, I also encourage clients to be savvy consumers. And if they find themselves in any kind of healing relationship where they feel like they're having to take care of the provider, then it might be good for them to, find somewhere else to land.
Hmm. I I am not nearly as trained or experienced or educated as you are in this, but I am reminded of a term. I don't know if it was coined, but at least I know it through Carl Jung, the idea of transference and
Mhm.
countertransference. That being able to have proper, I was going to say strong, but sometimes boundaries don't need to be strong. They need to be present, but not necessarily use that word for it. But being able to have boundaries is, and not only set them up, but to be able to maintain them and reset them when necessary
Mhm.
is key to building trust, which healing can't happen in a lot of ways without trust. And I'm reminded of a book, The Trusted Advisor,
Mm.
talking, it was designed specifically for business advisors. But in it, they give an equation called the trust equation. And one of the variables, one of the factors in what creates trust is something they termed self orientation, meaning how often does the advisor reference themselves or speak as themselves, use I, basically. And the less you have of that, the higher trust can be, because you're not making it about you. You're letting it be about that person. And
Mhm.
for me, it can be tough to juggle because sometimes there are moments where you're educating or leading in some respects. And even right now, as a host of the show, there is a certain amount of leading the conversation along. But I recognize, along with what you're saying, there is a deep connection between letting it be about the person and not making it about you that allows for trust and healing.
Yes. Yeah, a client's time is this time that's for them. That doesn't mean that we're not forming a relationship, though. And in fact, having a healthy relationship between the client and therapist, and even exploring what comes up in that relationship, what feelings clients might have towards me, especially as we're doing certain work, what is that evoking for them? That it's not just about me and them. It's also creating a blueprint that can change how they relate with others in the world. And so I think that there's a lot of power in a way that can have, and it does need to be regularly like checked and taken care of. And there's different styles of therapy, ones that are more or less emphasizing the relationship. But I think that especially once you move into psychedelic work, where there's other forms of support and other ways of working together that are very different than traditional psychotherapy, there's even more need to have a sense of trust. If you're going to let go and let yourself be in an expanded state while guided by a provider. We'll probably touch on that later on,
Mm,
but just wanted to name that too.
right. Well, let's dive into that because I want to understand better how therapeutic psychedelic use plays into your practice and why. Just help me understand what you're doing there and what effects it has.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned from kind of earlier on in my life, I've always been interested in different ways we can harness powers of the mind, but also kind of connect to deeper senses of who we are. Along with that, I've had an interest in expanded states of mind. So, what are different practices that we can use to change our mood and mind state, and maybe even go into different brave wavelengths? Tongue twister there. Um, so, I've been interested in breath work, meditation practices, all kinds of different things that change our state. Psychedelics become just another tool that allow us to do the same. They allow us to access other parts of who we are. I don't know if you've ever seen that image of what our brain looks like when it's not on a psychedelic, and then the diagram of what it looks like where it is when it is. And there's all these different other points of connection because all these other parts of the brain are online and talking to each other. And just that alone is really exciting to me, that we have all these other aspects of our really powerful brain that don't get to talk to each other, and what happens when they do. But coming back to, reining myself in here, coming back to the therapeutic question, I primarily use psychedelic psychotherapy to support clients with depression, anxiety, with trauma work, with existential distress, but also to help them get unstuck. That's kind of the most global way I can describe it. Whether they're stuck in their life or stuck at a point of indecision, they have grief that's hard to let go of, they have symptoms that they're having difficulty managing with more traditional approaches, then, this might be on the table as a tool to use.
Hmm. I'll bring it back to this book here, The Archetype of Initiation, where they described several different models of what it looks like to transform in one's life. And generally speaking, we'll say there's 3 steps in anyone's particular transformation in their life. The first is life is good. Things are going as they're supposed to. It's rational. You're sane. Good job. Number 2 is everything falls apart. Nothing's working anymore. The effort you're putting in is not getting you the results you expected. And your life just falls apart. Not great feeling. Number 3 then is when you've reintegrated. You've become a new person in the sense that you now have all that experience, which is now wisdom, that you understand better how the world works and where you fit in it. The interesting thing about the research done and the stories told in this book is that it explains getting to part 3 is not guaranteed. You can stay stuck, like you're saying, in this disintegrated middle section of transformation where people are feeling like the world around them is not operating the way they prefer it to, or the way it should, at least. So help me understand then, why is it that psychedelics aid in that getting unstuck part of healing?
Mhm. Well, part of it is that, we have a lot of conditioning. So, meaning, all day long, the way that we operate, what we think, how we narrate our experiences, our emotional reactions, and our actions or inaction, it's got a lot of habit behind it. And so we can start to get stuck just by the nature of ways in which we are creatures of our own, even internal habits. We can also have different things arise. Maybe for some unexplained reason, we suddenly have symptoms. We might not understand it. I sometimes see people that all of a sudden, at the age of 45, they now have tremendous panic and can't drive to work, right? It just happens. And for other folks, they might have had something for a really long time, but they didn't know how to name it. They always, let's say, found themselves really preoccupied and needing to make sure everything is in order, and had this perfectionism that both served them, let's say, professionally, but also agonizes them internally. And they didn't realize that they're thriving off of either like an inner critic narrative, or that they do have kind of a more rigid way that they guide themselves in life using anxiety as a mechanism. So traditional therapy can certainly be helpful in terms of um, unpacking the past if that's what needs to happen, but also finding new ways to relate to one's experience and changing the power that the mind may have, and in terms of letting really your true self guide you, as opposed to, like, let's say, your anxiety or your fears. But there are times in which it only gets you so far, or there might be times where maybe a person is seeking a really deeper understanding, and that would take a long time to do that kind of work. But psychedelics might be able to expedite that process, because what they do is they turn off our default mode network, this typical way that we think, feel, and behave. is muted for the time that you are taking the psychedelic. And instead, all of these other connections can happen, and people can experience really profound inner wisdom, or have other things arise that's kind of kept aside in their unconscious mind, still affecting them, but they just don't realize it. So that's a little bit of why I might
Mm,
consider doing this work.
yeah. The, I would say, perhaps mainstream perception of psychedelics is connected to, let's say, Woodstock, Burning Man, who knows what else. But I know you recently went to a conference wherein, I suppose, he he phoned this in. Stanislav Grof appeared at this conference, and I know he's pioneered a lot of this research. And you're smiling. Tell me more about the scientific side of what we know
Sure.
about psychedelics as therapy.
Well, I will say first that Stanislav Grof did something for the field that was really incredible. In that, when psychedelics went underground after the war on drugs, he developed another methodology to still access expanded states of mind without the use of any medicines, using a breathwork practice called holotropic breathwork. And so there were many people who continued to have transformative experiences and psychedelic like states from using this practice of just breathing in a particular way for a sustained period of time. There's more nuance than that, of course, but I think it's really important to credit him. Yeah, tell me a little bit about, like, give me a little bit more direction of what I could tell you about this.
Sure, of course. What I'm feeling, speaking for the audience, if they haven't tuned out already because of the subject, speak to a traditional minded, uneducated person on what this is, what this does, why this isn't simply hippie, woo woo, spiritual stuff, and speak to the practical, positive outcomes that people have experienced.
Sure. Well, first of all, you can definitely dive into a whole lot of research around it. I mean, if you look at from what happened, research on psychedelics was already happening, in the 60s and 70s. So it wasn't just a bunch of hippies using it. There was a lot of applications, including for, addiction and other major like societal problems. Obviously a lot of things had to go underground, and psychedelic research really remained in the hands of certain institutions when that was available, but even outside of the US, and before kind of coming back here in America to more persistent research. But if you just look at what's happened and you look since 2020, you're going to find that there's just this exponential amount of articles being published with application of psychedelics for some very difficult to treat conditions, pervasive OCD, um, substance use disorders, so-called treatment-resistant depression, where people have tried 3 or more antidepressants without relief. You're seeing some interesting interventions even for habits like quitting smoking. You see it for enhancement of couples, and to support individuals who have cancer and are facing the end of their life, for them to have less existential distress. So there is still an element of it being spiritual, because for many people it is kind of a spiritual molecule, so to speak. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that sometimes that spiritual domain too can help us gain a different perspective on our suffering, and also connect with, again, that sense of we are more than our life difficulties. But there's a lot of very compelling research. I will say, I don't want to romanticize psychedelics. They are not for everyone. There's certainly folks for whom they would be
Mm.
unsafe to use, and there is a way to use them judiciously. There's also ways that they are really helpful that are more recreational in nature. A lot of good things came out of those hippie days. There were people with big visions for the world and taking care of our planet and wanting to have more harmony that, frankly, I think we kind of need a little bit more in society too.
Mm. So next team meeting, we're gonna all trip a little bit. Is that what we're saying? we're advocating for
I will.
and have a
Well,
team brainstorm.
I'm not sure if you saw a recent article. I believe it was in Wall Street Journal. It might have been New York Times. I can pull it up and give you as a reference later for your audience. But it was actually talking about how popular psychedelic use is becoming in places like the Silicon Valley. People are using it also to enhance creativity and boost well-being. It's not that is probably less researched in part because research institutions aren't really interested as much in how can we become more creative thinkers. They're funding more of research that's surrounding illnesses that cause a lot of burden to society or are medically costly. But there's a whole heck of a lot of that very thing that you're talking about, people using it together to enhance the work that they do.
Hmm. I suppose that there's a strong, or at least significant, selection bias in who seeks these things out. I wouldn't imagine the legal department or the finance people to be seeking these types of things out, or someone in those departments rather, over, say, someone in marketing, a more creative style of work. So I'll take this back and bring this back to the the idea of having a an outer person, a third party that's interested in your success as a person, as a client, coachee. Uh, yeah. In mentioning again that when we talk about experiencing breakdown, experiencing things are not going right the way that they used to, something has to change. I have to change to meet this new way that the world is presenting itself to me. I have to understand it more fully for me to operate again in a calm and sane way. There needs to be a guide in that process, that there is so much we can do for ourselves, and there's a lot of therapy and coaching techniques that we can apply for ourselves, and that's just a great self practice. But maybe tell me more about why having a guide through your healing is such an important piece of the puzzle.
You mean more broadly or with psychedelics or both?
Let's, yeah, with psychedelics, and then we can zoom out.
Well, I will say a few things. One is that paying attention to how you're going to be using psychedelics in terms of like preparing yourself internally and having like moderate expectations, cultivating a mindset to get the most out of it. You can learn about that from some books and things like that, but it can be helpful to have a person work with you to support you in that preparation process. And then during the medicine experience, a lot can come up. There can be things that can come up that are delightful, but also confusing and challenging. And rather than getting stuck there again, having a person who's with you might help you go through that experience. And sometimes when people have difficult things arise, but it's occurring not in the right setting, or they don't know how to get themselves through that experience in an altered state, it results in a traumatizing experience. So, having somebody
Mm,
there who can guide you can really reduce the likelihood of that. Not to mention that things can happen medically, and it's just safer to have a person who can support you. And there's lots of different forms of guides. There can be people who are just a good support system and know how to get you through that, all the way to professionals that are therapists. But there's also a rich history for thousands of years of medicines that create expanded states of mind being used in indigenous cultures. And so there's a tremendous amount of healing wisdom that those kinds of guides may have that's very different than these other approaches we're talking about here. But you mentioned in the process of transformation that you have to kind of then integrate, and that's the same word we use in psychedelic psychotherapy. So, whatever arises for you, you then have to figure out, how do you put it all together? How do you use it in service of your transformation beyond that time that you were having that medicine experience, that journey? And so that's where it's really helpful to work with someone who can help you digest what it is that came up and weave it into the fabric of who you are.
Hmm. On this show, we talk a lot about our core values. And for me personally, my second most important value is integrity. And then the first is courage, which is very much the core theme of this entire show. When we talk about integrity, we're talking about being integrated. What to be integrated means to at times face your fears. What have you seen or experienced yourself that in the process of healing, it requires courage to complete?
Gosh, so much of, I think, the process of healing can take courage. I think it takes courage to venture into the unknown, to close out a life chapter that isn't serving you, whether that's letting go of a relationship or a job that's not serving you. Sometimes something happens, we have to kind of reinvent ourselves. I certainly have had some challenges that came up for me health wise, where I had to really dismantle how I used to think of my value and worth, and instead find other ways to think of, okay, well, what else is there to me? Or yeah, I think that a lot of about courage is about like stepping into something that is potentially unfamiliar, but just because it's unfamiliar doesn't mean it's dangerous. And doing
Mm,
psychedelic work takes a lot of courage, right? Here you are, you're going to ingest something and it's going to take you somewhere, but you don't know where you're going to go. You know you're going to come back, but you don't know where it's going to take you at that time. And so allowing that process to also then be something that somebody else is witnessing takes courage too, where you know that you're getting this unconditional, non judgmental support that can handle no matter what your body or what your mind, might be experiencing. But I really honor and respect when people are making that courageous choice, and that I have the privilege of sitting with them.
mm. This relates a lot to many of the common stories and journeys I see leaders in business and other organizations make, especially the closer you get to the top, where we can fill our days and our minds with reports and board meetings and all of these things that help us maintain, let's call it that phase one lifestyle, where things are going as they're supposed to, everything is rational. The further along we go with that, without having enough self awareness to see how we're responding to each day, because life, there's lots of unknown variables. We're always stepping out into the unknown in some ways. But to the extent that we are only looking at what is known and purposefully ignoring the things that we're afraid of looking at that are unknown, eventually it gets to that breakdown, inevitably. And what I see with a lot of leaders is they will patch that up with retreats, with vacations, with lots of fun activities that may be rejuvenating to the body, but not necessarily to the soul.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could comment on the difference between those band aid solutions and what you might see or say as a more full solution to that problem.
Well, I'll first start off by saying that, you and I both work with probably a lot of really brilliant people. And at the same time, part of their brilliance might be that they spend a lot of time in their head. And so it's harder for them to perhaps at times pay attention to their feelings, or maybe even access connection with their body kind of below the head, anything that happens there, where there's a lot of really
Mm,
useful information. But if we're really always in doing mode, there's a lot that we can start to tune out and not pay attention to. And sometimes our talents can also lead to things like overworking, disconnecting, numbing out in other ways. And so I think a lot of the work I really enjoy is to help people live life more consciously, regardless of which approach I'm using. But that also does involve a lot more of slowing down and dropping in and really noticing, what is happening for you on the inside, not just thinking through our problems or using that capacity that we have. It's already very well trained for a lot of probably our clients that we work with. So, what does it mean to have deeper transformation? Well, I do think that those things you're talking about can be helpful because they can take us out of the grind and off the hamster wheel and put us in a different setting that's immersive. But sometimes what happens is, yeah, we go on that vacation, but are we still really asking ourselves, is are things in our life okay? Or do we just pretend that everything's fine and we try to enjoy that vacation? Or is that vacation something that just provides a very temporary relief, but underneath it, there's still, let's say, pervasive anxiety or burnout or grief we've swept aside because there just wasn't any time for it. The fact is, we constantly have life difficulties arising, and sometimes we live lifestyles where we're not really pausing to process and make room for it so that it can digest, or it can like compost and process out. And so sometimes that does lend itself, like therapy can become a container where you expose a lot of those things to air so that they can have a chance to move through you, as opposed to just being ignored where they're going to come out, kind of like in your closet where you put stuff on that top shelf and you just pray to God no one opens the closet door, but it tumbles right out. We all have like sometimes that way that we relate to our life stuff. And so yeah, then you get into that phase that you talked about, I think phase two, where it starts tumbling out.
Hmm. To summarize the conversation we've had so far, what would you say are some tips or some actions that listeners can consider acting on to to integrate, to begin to take these things more seriously in their life?
Hmm. Well, I would say on a basic level, I think all of us could use a little bit more slowing down. So, not trying to have every minute
Hmm.
be optimized. So maybe there's a time you go for a walk, but you're not actually also trying to listen to a podcast, although maybe that's where you're listening to this episode now. And I don't want to discourage that. But, maybe to have some more meals with the television
Right.
off, or more times where we, intentionally connect with the beings that we love and pay attention, like look at them with fresh eyes. Those little things that when we reach the end of our life, people regret most, not what they haven't done. They regret, opportunities they've missed out on. And the things they remember the most are moments where they had a lot of flow, meaning they were really absorbed in the experience. That's what
Hmm.
we remember at the end of our life. So I just want to invite all of us, how do we create a bit more of that? Those spaces also tend to lend themselves more to flexible thinking and creativity, which executives need, and then can take that into their world. If someone is considering psychedelic therapy, I think there's a lot of options. But one of those options is to find a provider that is either able to work with you around your own private psychedelic use, or if you're seeking psychedelic therapy, to find a provider who meets qualifications that are consistent with what you're looking for, understanding that there's only ketamine is the legal psychedelic in all 50 states, and other medicines are not legal. But if a person is curious about that, you can start to even research using places like Psychology Today or Therapy Den or the Psychedelic Support Network, and looking for a psychedelic therapist near you if that's a path you want to explore. But also remember, there's lots of ways you can change your frame of mind. You can learn how to regulate your breath or move your body, or even alter how you're eating or sleeping that might still be enhancing your mind and maybe even giving you more of that spiritual connection that many of us may crave but don't know how to access in the pace of the modern world.
I love that. So, Tatyana, if people wanted to connect with you, where would they find you easiest?
Sure. Easiest place is on my Instagram. I'm at therapy mindfully. That's mindfully with two L's. And on there, there's a link to my profile that takes folks to my group practice website, meditation practices I have offered for free, and all kinds of other resources. And I'm also happy to create a post of resources that might be helpful for your audience specifically to go out in time with the release of this episode. So if there's something that they're curious about, they can beeline right over to my Instagram and save those resources if that's useful for them.
I love that and appreciate it. And again, this may not be for everyone, like you said, but for those it is, let's educate and let's see where you're most comfortable, if this makes sense for you to do or to explore. Because, in the broadest sense, being able to distinguish between therapy and coaching and what is available, what tools we can use to help you through, be it a hard situation or just wanting to optimize things that are already going well for you. These are the conversations that we're having and the resources we want to provide to help you do that. So, Tatyana, in closing, what has yet to be said?
Gosh, that's a big closing question. I mean, the biggest thing is I think coming back to just my life philosophy as I want to impart that one is that we're all going to have some difficulties, and that doesn't mean anything other than like that's what it means to be human. Is sometimes things may fall apart, and we can need support through those times. And also that underneath all that is still our capacity to have joy and peace and compassion and forgiveness. But if those things are hard to access, then therapy might be a route that can help you get back to your sense of you or to help you transform. Because when you've gone through a big life experience, you're not trying to go back to who you are. You're trying to figure out who are you now becoming. And so I want to create an invitation for that. And anywhere you are in kind of the spectrum of feeling your ideal self to really feeling troubled, at any point in that continuum, you don't have to be doing it alone. And it can be helpful to pair with whether a coach or a therapist for support on your path.
Very good. Thank you. Well, Tatyana, I appreciate you coming on the show. I learned so much and have so many more questions. But for now, I'll say thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great chatting, and I can tell that you really love the work that you do. And so I just also want to pause and express appreciation for all the people you're supporting with this podcast and in whatever capacities clients are lucky to work with you.
Of course. Well, I'm Sam, the Courage Coach for Executives. And remember, it starts with you.